Hello, GDC. Hi. You guys look fantastic. How are you doing? The chatter means you're having a good time. Wonderful. All right, before we settle in, just some quick words to get y'all started. A reminder that this is being recorded by a very nice camera that's much nicer than whatever you have. So please refrain from videotaping, but I will encourage you to take pictures, as you'll see. I won't be doing questions after, but I will be in the handy wrap-up area just outside. So let's get going. All right, so before we get started, here's kind of our agenda for what we're going to talk about. Today we're going to start with, surprise, a theater history lesson on the idea of the modern ensemble. Then we're going to talk about how to put it into action, and we'll close with a common language to start getting an interdisciplinary group together to tell stories. So again, before we get started, two things. We'll be discussing spoilers for these titles and more. Second thing, keep your camera ready for still pictures, no videos. I'm looking at you. For slides where there's a lot of text or a critical slide, there's a camera up in the corner to let you know to take a picture of this for later. And now for me, hi, my name is Allison Lures. I'm an associate narrative director and theater artist. I trained in performance and devising for theater at Western Washington University and performed unscripted theater professionally for about 13 years or so, while also working as a game dev. I was on the creative lead of world building at Wizards of the Coast and worked on everything from Magic the Gathering to Baldur's Gate 3. And now I am an associate narrative director for seasonal content on Destiny 2. But I am not here to talk about what we make. I'm here to talk about how. Why did this skip ahead like so many slides? Oh my God. All right, so the story of the ensemble starts with the true story of how a medium was changed by changing how it was made. We begin, as all dangerous ideas do, with two art nerds complaining about brunch. It happened inside a busy restaurant in Moscow on June 22nd, 1897. At 2 p.m. that day, two men, Konstantin Stanislavski and Vladimir Nemerovich Danchenko, sat down to discuss the state of Russian theater, which was in a heinously dismal state. Theater of that time was a lot. Melodramas were popular at the time. So the style is kind of like, imagine if Nick Cage's style of acting was the peak of performance. It wasn't performers inhabiting a character so much as performing emotions. And it was built around the star system, where entire productions would be spun up around one single actor. Again, very Nick Cage. And when productions were made, it was kind of in siloed pieces. So the set designer would get the gist of the show and reuse something in storage. Costumes might make a custom piece for whoever that star is they're building around, but everyone else kind of gets what's on wardrobe already. And staging, I got it. Great idea. Give us one flat line so we can see everyone's face. Nick Cage style, no depth. Again, it just kind of thrown together, right? And worse, theater in Moscow in 1897 was funded by the ruling class, and their tastes, even when they weren't terribly informed, built and determined what theaters rose and fell. Sounds kind of familiar to our industry, right? In Stanislavski's own words, Vladimir, like me, thought the theater's situation hopeless, for the brilliant traditions of the past had degenerated into a plain collection of easy technical devices. The theater was in the hands of dilettantes and bureaucrats. I think we all know a few dilettantes and bureaucrats, too. The conversation at the restaurant was so electric, it continued late into the night. Stanislavski and Nemerovich wanted to make sure that actors and designers were central to the theater, both actors and designers. They mapped out their values and emerged with a foundation for revolution centered around an ensemble ethos that discouraged individual vanity in favor of creating something collectively with a set group of interdisciplinary artists over time. They started their brunch at 2 p.m., and they talked until 8 the next morning. 1 year later, the Moscow Art Theater was born, and in Stanislavski's opening speech, he urged his friends and colleagues to dedicate their lives to creating, quote, the first rational, moral, and accessible theater. And it was. Their ensemble survived investor changeovers, the October Revolution, even Stanislavski having a heart attack on stage. And the troupe disbanded after 90 years after it was founded. What Stanislavski and Nemrovich Danchenko created that wild night in 1897 was a radical manifesto on how they wanted to work. They wanted a cross-disciplinary group of individuals, so a director, playwright, designers, performers, to collaboratively create new works. And they wanted to work over many years of time, not just one-off projects. And each discipline bore equal weight. The sets were just as important as the costumes, were just as important as the blocking, were just as important as the script, because they were all contributing towards the same holistic work. And when I say work, it's a capitalized W. The work is the final product, cool, but more importantly, it's the method of creation and collaboration. For this method of ensemble creation to function, the work had to be prioritized. The final product, sure, but how it was made was what matters. So departing theater and returning to games, for the most part, the game industry is already kind of structured this way. Studios of roughly the same people work on many projects over many years, sharing the same common goal. Think how this contrasts with the film industry, right? Where each movie has a different group of people who work on it. They change in and out. But rather than working as a holistic ensemble, we usually work in silos. Art, design, narrative, audio work separately, with each silo responsible for their own kind of separate thing from the others. And there's a lot of sturm and drang, even at this conference, over who should start their part first and who should follow. And inside those silos are pyramids, with everyone working to support one voice at the top. And usually it's that discipline's director, right? Who is in an additional pyramid supporting the vision of a creative director. So how do we go from creating game stories where everyone's supporting one voice to creating stories with a system where not only is everyone contributing and supporting everyone else, but individual expertise is also shining through to create something holistic? So how do we create as an ensemble without it combusting into constant argument, or one person steering everybody else, or devolving into design by committee, blah? Working as a true ensemble requires a shift in values that everyone has to buy into to make it work. The most challenging hurdle, that one in blue, the notion that each of these other ones touches, the one that isn't just faced at the start, but every single day, is relinquishing control, especially as the director or the lead. But what is gained in that trade-off is security, trust, and the freedom of shared ownership. So let's break down these values. Be kind, not nice. This is the most powerful rule of engagement. Nice withholds opinions to not cause strife or make anyone upset. It shuts up to protect others' feelings. But kind knows that we can give and take critical feedback without dealing damage, that it's more cruel to let opinions fester and not be shared. Next up, make a case. I don't believe in design by committee or democracy, but I do believe in design by conversation. So if someone disagrees with the group and cares passionately, but the rest of the group is aligned, we make space, and at the very least, hear them out. This is how we resolve disagreements. And if the idea isn't convincing, then the rest of us are kind. And whoever is assigned to call the shots, and there should be someone who is assigned to call shots, even in this structure, is the one who lets them know. Everyone gets a fair shake. And violent choices. The majority of poor collaborative experiences happen because someone refuses to make a clear choice. You circle the drain and wander way out of goals. It's a miserable and uncertain place. And I say violence because violence is decisive. It is a decision that is, when it's made, it negates all other options and clears a path forward for everyone. Now, as you work, listen for when the time calls for a violent choice. Make it and stick to it. That's how we can keep momentum. And then will and grace, not the TV show. Will is the courage to speak up. It's to put out an idea, to identify that no one is doing anything and take initiative. And grace is accepting what the ensemble wants, letting your ideas go, supporting what the work with a capital W needs. Every creator must be able to balance both when working collaboratively. Next, you aren't your ideas. Preciousness is dangerous. It's fearing not taking feedback. It's holding on to an idea simply because it is yours. It's creating while holding on to shame. I tell our writers' room, we love bad art. We love unfinished garbage. We love trash. Show me your worst writing you've ever done in your life. Because if you bring it when it's in that stage, when it's a thumbnail, then we can give the most helpful feedback. And we do that to emphasize that you aren't your ideas. You have the grace to let go of a cool idea when you can tell it isn't going where the work is. And an important value of this as well is that, as an old phrase I learned when I was in college, is theater, not therapy. Know the difference between making something for an audience and making something for yourself. Because the first is a powerful gift, and the latter puts your heart on the firing line. And finally, hold yourself accountable. This is the most important one. This is the most important value. You are responsible for your own boundaries and your own attachment. You need to know when to speak up and when to lead with your idea and when to back off and know when your idea isn't fitting. Unless everyone is holding themselves to the same standard, this is how we invite disharmony. So in practice, those values are what keep effective collaboration from turning into design by committee. We don't want everyone's ideas shoved in because that's how we lose focus and direction. It's how we make a final product that doesn't say anything. But design by collaboration prioritizes the work, which, remember, is both what we make, but more importantly, how we make it. We listen to what the work wants and are using will to introduce ideas and grace to let them go. And most importantly, again, there's still a shot caller here. Like, even though we're working in a very flat structure, when we hit that, like 5% of the time when we can't make a decision, one person needs to be able to go, yep, we're doing that one, to make sure that things move. So finally, in our values, and most radically, sear this sentence into your brains. Environmental storytelling isn't a strong enough way to describe what I'm talking about. Every discipline is a vector for story. Every game dev is capable of telling a story through their discipline. And when I say story, and here's a free story definition, we were just asked for those. When I say story, I mean it in the absolute broadest way possible. Story as the perceptual ability to see and understand logic systems as an arrangement of collected information. Whoa, it's a crunchy one. And when I talk about narrative in this talk, I'm referring to the discipline responsible for implementation of story through dialogue and systems. Narrative is something narrative does, but story is something all disciplines can do. So to reinforce that idea, our high-level story should be broken by the leads of every discipline working together with the writers. Bring in your design leads, your art leads, your audio leads, your cinematic expert into that writer's room. This probably sounds alarming, but having lots of different brains from the very start in that room will build holistic stories. It also means early buy-in and a sense of ownership from all of those different people. It prevents table flipping and seagulling later when you tell them what the story is, because they were already in there. And most importantly, narrative first or design first is a fallacy, because great games are made as a marriage of both disciplines, and they move as one. So now we've got all these different people in a room, and we're sharing the same values. Now, how do we build together using a common language so that we can all share and communicate? Our sister medium of theater already figured this out. So let's learn from them and apply the lessons from immersive physical performance into immersive digital performance. Meet Mary Overly. She was an American choreographer, a dancer, and an experimental theater artist. The big question that she asked was, what are dance and theater made of? Visual art has a vocabulary to describe it, but performance did not. So when Mary was dividing up the parts of dance and theater, she didn't divide them by choreography, set design, audio design, lighting design, costuming. She didn't see set design as separate from movement or lighting as separate from costuming, but all of them serving a single experience. So what she made was called the viewpoints. Mary later collaborated with my hero, American director Anne Bogart, in the 1980s, and they continued building on this idea of the viewpoints. The two worked together, and Anne built on the ideas that Mary overly established when she formed her own ensemble, City Company. So what Mary and Anne created was a way to talk about story in an interdisciplinary way. They understood that the parts of theater that aren't the script and the set design and the lights and the blocking, it's all one final holistic experience, that we hinder ourselves by thinking that they're separate. And so the vocabulary they created is a way for every discipline that we know to be able to talk to each other and express story in unique ways that suit everyone's talents. So this is vocabulary to teach across your teams, because as you'll see, it encourages us to think about story using every tool in our toolbox. All right, here we go. We'll start with space. So space, and the viewpoints, by the way, are broken down into 3 categories of space, shape, and time. Space is unique to performance and to games because both are mediums built around immersing the audience or player in a shared space, physical or digital. First up is architecture, and by architecture, I mean the structures that define the space we occupy in the game. So everything from trees to buildings to rooms to dungeons. In the viewpoints, it's all architecture. So the Horizon series shines when we see familiar architecture in unfamiliar ways. And the moment when we swim through the Vegas Strip and emerge at the very end is stunning because it allows the moment to breathe with the architecture. Here, that architecture, that shared environmental space, is our reward at the end. And it's a wonderful visual metaphor for the life that we've brought back to the desert. Spatial relationship. This means the distance between objects in the space, so the player to other NPCs, or to enemies, or to the architecture. Spatial relations conveys a relationship, right? In this frame, from the first few minutes of JFO, who is Cal in relation to that Star Destroyer? We know that they are connected from this framing, and that the Empire is represented as a dominant figure, but very distant and far away. It literally towers over the landscape, and thus over Cal, both physically and from a storytelling standpoint. Topography is the path a player travels or a character traverses. So what stories can we convey through the paths that we travel? In Season 19 of Destiny 2, there's a secret quest that leads to a very special surprise. Paw prints in an area lead away from the main action. And they follow down and away, then really the fuck out of the way. And at the end, if we got rid of all the security drones, we gain access to find a very sweet robot dog at the very end. That path, that distance, that topography we traveled tells us that this exodog was supposed to be a secret. The computer that runs this place was built to build war satellites. And at the very back of the longest path, we find the heart that computer kept safe from the world. Now for descriptions of visuals with an emphasis on bodies. Yay, characters in space. Shape is how we think of shape in visual mediums. It's the same thing, but with bodies, figures. So shape is the contour or outline of bodies in space, the shape of the body itself, or relating to others or the architecture. So think of lines and curves, angles, either stationary or in motion. So how do we tell stories with shape? The cool thing is that it doesn't have to have an inherent meaning. So here's a screenshot from Immortality, where we see Ambrosio on his knees, leaning at the same heavy angle as the last tree in hell. The relationship between these shapes, these two bodies, it tells us who's clearly in charge here, and that Ambrosio and the architecture are telling us that Ambrosio belongs here. Gesture is a shape with meaning. So either behavioral gesture, realistic, yeah, or expressive, abstract, or symbolic. So here we see Ellie raising her hands in surrender. It's a realistic gesture. She's conveying fear, vulnerability, and as the player, we know what this gesture means. And the fact that she's doing it, callous, badass Ellie, who the fuck is she surrendering to? That's a scary moment. And another unique to games example of gesture is the gestures we ask the player to do in the physical act of playing our games. So how impactful is it in this very same game where the player strums their controller like a guitar? And what changes when later in the game we lose some fingers and we can't play the same way? It's a lot more powerful when the player is using gesture to tell that story. And finally, the spicy stuff. Telling a story with time itself. Tempo is how quickly or slowly an action occurs by the player, the NPC, or an aspect of the environment. So we can think of tempo as really fast, right? Like twitch-based play, hordes of enemies, like rapid action. But there's a whole other side to tempo that games has a hard time wrapping its head around sometimes. What story is told when we go slow? What story do we convey when we want a player to control their pace and ask for stillness? Ghost of Tsushima does a great job of playing with tempo. We shift back and forth between moments of charged action and intentional stillness, then bursting into action once again. Our samurai is a master of control, and we, as players, inhabit that play through that control, keeping a lid on it in actual physical play and purposeful stillness before exploding with directed action. This time, the gameplay is the character. Duration is how long an event occurs over time, how quickly, how slowly we can stretch out and manipulate time, how long the player or NPC maintains a particular movement, tempo, or gesture before it changes. So our instinct as designers wants to say, well, players don't want to spend a lot of time doing nothing. But what happens when the duration is the point? Pentiment is a game about history, what deserves to be called it. And my favorite moment of the game is a moment where nothing happens. Rather, it's a moment at the tavern near a dramatic conclusion where everyone in town gathers to listen to traveling musicians performing a song for Christmas. The gameplay stops. The characters settle down to listen. And it's a moment of reflection, a pause to look at every single character on screen and know that we're about to make a choice that ruins one of their lives. Fuck. That feeling, that, exactly. Kinesthetic response is the player's or NPC's spontaneous reaction to a motion that occurs outside of themselves. So it's an instinctive response to an external stimulus. What can we do to elicit a gasp, a laugh, or cough, or an exasperated ugh? And how does instinctual responses in our characters and players tell a story? We can also write scenes built around our characters' involuntary reactions. Characters are alive. I was about to say they're human. They're not always human, but they respond because they're alive and living in the world. And it's infinitely more interesting to watch somebody sneeze than it is to watch them say a prepared line of dialogue. So the one is a great example of kinesthetic response because the first time we meet her, we feel her first, like in your hands, and then we hear a strange noise, and if we rewind it, out of nowhere, a smash edit comes, and we can't help but startle, but the startle happens for two reasons. One, that's a fucking solid jump scare. And in terms of the story, it's the gasp of waking up. It's alertness. It's a mirror of the narrative revelation that in this story, there's someone else just behind me the whole time. And finally, repetition is one of my favorite tools. It is repeating an action, motif, visual design, music signature, or a line of dialogue. Now, at the end of the game Control, you're put into a dreamlike situation as an office worker. You're flooded with basic tasks, making copies, tidying up coffee cups, emptying bins, and the repetition hammers home the titular concept of the game. Your actions and thought patterns have shrunk your world down to a small number of actions. And you, as the player, create your own enclosure through repeated actions. And finally, repetition is one of my favorite tools. It is repeating an action, motif, visual design, music signature, or line of dialogue. Thank you for suffering that bad joke. Repetition can also connect unlike ideas to change its meaning. So you press X to kill humans like tons of times in Last of Us Part 2, but why is that repetition different when you press X to kill a dog? It hits different because the action is repeated, but the context is altered. That repetition and the juxtaposing discomfort we feel as a player is the story. So now, zooming way back to the start, we can imagine being in that writer's room, in that story intensive, working alongside our design director, our audio director, our art director, using a shared language now, where we can say, hey, we want this story thing to happen. And now there's a vocabulary for that design director to go, I can play with tempo to communicate that. Or our art director can go, I've got a good idea for the architecture for this one. And now we can start to play off of everyone else's strengths to tell something. All right, get out your cameras. So I am going to put up a couple of slides with just like a pile of questions to help open up conversations about each of these. So yeah, here's questions you can ask yourselves to start playing with the viewpoints as you tell your stories across disciplines. So when you and all those different brains are breaking the story, you can ask, how does the path a player travel tell us who they are? What are we saying when we create distance or closeness between the player and another NPC? How does the architecture support or even lead the story? All right. Are our gestures realistic or expressive? What is the contour of an NPC in relation to that architecture, and what does that mean? What gestures are they using? How do they know we can see them? Do their actions change, whether they're public or private? How might that change what they do, and what does that convey? And the last one, I swear, most importantly, communicating with all the viewpoints demands that we use all the tools in our toolbox. If we are a medium where the player experiences time at the same rate as the content, then why shouldn't we use time to tell a story? What does it mean when we encourage stillness? What story do we convey when we speed up the actions or use gameplay to tell us about how a character feels? That's incredible. So here we are. We have an ensemble, each with a different expertise, able to do what they do best while still being part of a holistic whole, communicating in the same language to express it in individual ways, working together to create one incredible story. And with all that vocabulary, those tools, those values, you now have a way for an ensemble of game developers to start thinking like Stanislavski and Nemrovich-Danchenko did. Because when they prioritized how they made things, it changed their entire medium. The ensemble of Moscow Art Theater made work in this style that is called realism. It was a cool fad at the time. And it's the idea that art should imitate life. It should embody it, not just imitate it. That every part of a production should talk to each other, with set design that feels part of a story, with acting that acts like people behaved, with words like how people talked, and that trend of realism that their ensemble embraced and made famous in theater carried into a new medium of the time, cinema, and even a century later, games. The reason that realism still has a hold on our movies, our theater, our games, is because a group of artists in 1897 decided to work the way they wanted to. And what they can teach us, we can carry forward here into our medium. How we work is just as important as what we make. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, and don't forget to please fill out your evaluations. I'll be around in the wrap-up area for questions, so we can talk about collaboration. I can give you more theater history lessons. I got lots. Thank you all so much for your time. Have a wonderful evening.